enjoy a seat at the table and good company, where great conversations and meaningful discussions happen.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sara Fiedelholtz, a conversationalist. We all know that a great dinner party really isn't about the food. It's about the people sitting around the table enjoying great conversations and discussions. I am pleased to be in the company of Joshua Schipper, the president of the Fort Wayne Road Commission and author of Crossroads to History, Paving Through Fort Wayne Streets. And for complete disclosure, Joshua is also the intern on And Good Company, so he's usually behind the camera, and this time we're bringing him out front to talk about his incredible feat of actually writing and publishing a book. Mm-hmm. And you're a junior at Purdue Fort Wayne. Yep. So you did this even while you're still a student.
Oh yeah, yeah.
So I can only imagine what you'll be doing once you graduate. But let's talk about the book.
Right.
So Crossroads of History. How did it become an idea? What was your interest in looking at how the streets and roads in Fort Wayne, Allen County got their names?
Well, there's the biggest thing was probably the genealogy section here at the Allen County Public Library. I've always had an interest in history and then our own history here in the county. So I was just walking through one day, probably 8th grade or early high school, and I saw this book about the history of our road names here in Fort Wayne and Allen County. And so I picked it up, opened it up, and there was the history of all of these different roads that I drive on every day. And I also noticed that it hadn't been updated in 70, 75 years. So it really got me thinking maybe I should update this.
Right. And it also, what you found though, actually wasn't really a book, right?
Yeah, it was a speech to the Quest Club here in Allen County.
Yeah, and the Quest Club is a club where members do papers on different topics.
Yeah.
And so, and you actually have to be invited to be a member of the Quest Club.
Yeah.
So it was actually someone who did a paper about it. Yeah, and the Quest Club's been around for over 100 years, so that would make sense.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think you made a really good point that I thought about when I was looking at the book, which is the idea that we take it for granted how every day we are literally driving through history, but we don't really give it much thought. And especially nowadays, I mean, with GPS, you don't even think about how the roads intersect or why they are the way they are. You know, we all just sort of listen to the voice to tell us where to go. So as you start to do this research, what surprised you the most about uncovering or discovering why roads are named the way they are?
A lot of people didn't write things down. And that was probably the biggest headache going through this, trying to make not assumptions, but very, very educated guesses as to, like, considering the geography, who used to own the land, what businesses were around the area. They didn't write it down when they named the roads, a lot of them. So you had to take all of those factors into account when you're trying to find who that road was named after. So that was probably the biggest surprise, is there's no record.
Right.
Almost.
So you really had to be like a road street detective and sort of uncover and research. So let's go back to the start, the 18th century, and let's talk about the idea of the plat of Fort Wayne and how and who created that, and how this it all started with the roads for Fort Wayne.
So the original plat of Fort Wayne was designed by two businessmen, one from Ohio and one from the East Coast. Their names were John T. Barr Street's named for downtown, and then John McCorkle, who actually doesn't have anything named for him in the city and never did.
Wasn't there something named though for his daughter or a family member or something?
Not that I recall off the top of my head.
So he really got no credit.
He got no credit.
Okay.
They designed a plat with 5 streets going up and down, so north and south laterally, and then the longitudinal streets, there were 3 of them. We think that, so there's two reasons why they chose the particular slants that they did. Fort Wayne's streets are slanted 15 degrees.
Right, they're literally, they literally are.
Yeah. So one theory is that one of our old, I think the second or third American fort that was built here, where Fire Station 1 is today on Main Street, there were paths that came from the fort going east and west. And when you overlay the original plat onto this map, you can see that they lined up. And that's something that probably the historian who's at the forefront of Fort Wayne history, Bert Griswold, he made that observation in the 20s. And that's still one of the common theories as to why we have that slant. Another theory is that they had future knowledge of the Wabash and Erie Canal, and that slant would align with the direction of the canal. And they, even though the canal was built several years after the plat, there's a lot of the streets that Barr and McCorkle named who were canalmen and
so that was
supporters of the canal.
Prior to the canal being built.
Yeah.
So they actually had to have insight.
Yeah, that's the idea. We don't know for sure if they did, but that's another theory.
And didn't they also have to pay a lot more for the land than,
Yeah, they paid $26 an acre, which today, of course, is like amazing. But back then it was way too expensive for land. But the land that they bought was not only a big American post for like a military post, it was a French trading post before that because of the Native Americans who lived here. And the Native American Chief Little Turtle, who's buried along Spy Run Avenue, he said that Fort Wayne, in terms of transportation, was, I can't remember the exact quote, but it was a gateway. And so that's a quote that a lot of historians use as for the transportation innovations that Fort Wayne's had throughout its entire history.
So, okay, so they developed this original plat.
Yes.
So then what happened?
So they would sell different plats inside this land, and then people bought land outside of it and would base their roads and neighborhoods off of that 15-degree slant until Samuel Lewis was sent by, I want to say it was Thomas Jefferson was president at the time. He was sent to Fort Wayne to be an agent, I think with the Native Americans here for the federal government. And he built his neighborhood and his plat based on a true east and west orientation. Okay. So when you cross Lewis Street downtown, that's when everything shifts and you're actually going north and south. And then people based all of their stuff off of Lewis Street.
Okay, so that's how but one of the things that I like that I sort of found out with you researching the book, and that you become really knowledgeable about history and events and things. And so I've been using you as my personal, why is it this way? So the first thing I want to know is this whole thing with East DuPont and West DuPont. They're not even close to each other.
Yeah. A lot of, when you see roads split like that, it's because maybe a highway was later put through there and people don't want to change their address, so they leave it the way it is. And that's why we have California Road which actually has its own story as to why it's named California, but you have California Road on the east side of Fort Wayne by PFW. Okay. Does not connect at all with the other side of California on the west side of town by Hillegas Road. And that's because when they put the circumvent highway, now Coliseum Boulevard, in, they paved over that and then made it connect in different places.
So, and what's the story about? Isn't it named after the state of California, or go west, young man?
Along the same lines as that, the legend is that we had pioneers coming through Fort Wayne who would take that path during the gold rush in 1849. And there's also a rumor that when crews were building stuff along what is now Coliseum, that they found artifacts that the 49ers left on their way to California.
So as they like stopped here.
Yeah.
Wow.
They had set up camp along the road.
And the idea that there's this California that's named after something, there is this idea that it's sort of like when names were in vogue or themes. So we have other streets that are named after states, right?
Yeah.
And then we have some that are named after trees, and then also there was one that wanted to name the streets about the lakes, the Great Lakes.
Yes.
What happened there? Because I think we're missing a couple, aren't we?
Yeah. So there was a trend in the, I want to say, it was probably right after the canal had closed, where the citizens wanted all of their streets to be named, or at least have all of the Great Lakes within the streets. Because when people say, "Oh, I'm going to one of the Great Lakes," you can say that here because we're so close to them.
Right.
So it was a cultural thing at the time. So Water Street, which connected to water on both sides, was renamed to Superior Street.
Okay.
And then we had Erie Street on the west side of the east side of downtown. That was later turned into part of Berry Street. So
that's the one we don't have.
Yeah, the idea just didn't last very long.
Right.
Yeah.
But then we had but they were named after, there were French terms or the Native Americans.
Yeah.
And so, but some of the stories you find out about how streets are named after people. And a good one is this whole issue with Lincoln. Yeah. There's a big, lots of issues we have here with Lincoln.
A huge, Allen County did not like Lincoln when he was running for president.
Even though we say this is where he grew up.
Yeah, right? Even though Indiana, all of our signs say Lincoln's boyhood home.
Right.
He lost Allen County by almost double the votes the first time, and then well over the second time during the Civil War. The first time he came, his opponent, Stephen Douglas, came to Fort Wayne and gave a speech from one of the prominent houses here. Then he was paraded by like 10,000 people with torches around town. And then later that night, citizens burned an effigy of Lincoln outside of the courthouse, which we've had 4 different courthouses. We're not really good at making them. This one stayed for 100 years, but this one was one of the older ones. They burned an effigy there, and then they threw this gigantic log, almost like a tree, off of the Wells Street Bridge to symbolize Lincoln.
Wow.
Yeah. So we have a street named for Stephen Douglas here. It's a big street, Douglas Avenue.
Right.
And that was renamed 3 times. It was Hamilton first, and then Montgomery after Hamilton's son, and then the cultural trend swept those 2 names out for Douglas.
And is there any record that says why it was changed from one to the other, or is that part of the not having things written down?
That I've seen, no, there's not anything. There could be, there's certainly stuff out there that has not been linked up to this, or something that someone wrote down somewhere that we haven't found yet.
Right.
But yeah, names will change, and no one writes it down.
But let's talk about the Lincoln Highway, because he's got a pretty big highway there, but there's even some issues with that.
Yeah.
So tell me about that.
The Lincoln Highway was part of America's first highway system. It was a privately managed highway system. This was before the numbered highway system with like Route 66, before the state highway system. Before the federal.
Yeah.
Before the government took over the streets and like highways, there were organizations that would form to say, okay, we're going to manage these streets, and these will all be part of this highway across America. The Lincoln Highway went from New York to San Francisco. There's been a couple different orientations through Fort Wayne. The Lincoln Highway Association says that there were 3. There's some maps that say that there were 4. Sometimes map makers will just go by what people think it is instead of what it actually is. But the Lincoln Highway, ironically, the first orientation through Fort Wayne went across the Wells Street Bridge, which 2-3 decades before had been the site of the effigy being thrown off into the river.
So Lincoln was saying, I'm coming back.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
If we had any say, if the citizens here had any say, would they have named it for Lincoln? I don't know.
Right.
But yeah, it's I think the biggest memorial technically to Lincoln in the
Wow.
country, because it goes thousands of miles.
But and even if you tried like to follow the Lincoln Highway by those markers and stuff, I mean, there are places where it just is a dead end.
Yeah. There's places where the road doesn't exist anymore. You can't drive across the Wells Street Bridge anymore. It's a pedestrian bridge. There's sometimes it won't differentiate between which different orientation you're following. But there is a map on the Lincoln Highway Association's website where it shows each of the three. And then it shows on a black line, if you were to do it today, these are the streets that you would take so that you don't hit any dead ends.
Got it.
Yeah.
And there also is that the other bridge, not the Wells Street Bridge, but
I believe it's Harrison
Bridge,
Yeah.
where on it shows you like from here how many miles it is to California and then to New York. Why are we so interested? Is that part of this whole idea of the gateway, or what's the connection there?
Maybe it is part of that gateway. A lot of citizens I know were from New York, and some people even believe that this is mile zero on the Lincoln Highway that we measured in both directions. There's no like written documents to say that that's true, but that's a legend, a cultural legend that we have. But yeah, Fort Wayne's really connected itself with different parts of the country and naming the roads after certain states or people who barely had an impact on Fort Wayne, relatively speaking.
Who would that be?
We have a lot of presidents who we've named roads after, a lot of national senators. Calhoun probably was the one that I can't find a lot of information about how he impacted Fort Wayne, but that's one of the original, part of the original plat was Calhoun Street.
Right.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the idea that before there was the state highways and then the interstate, the idea that when there were those roads, the plank roads, like those were some of the original roads in and out of Fort Wayne, and that some of them even had tolls on them. So tell me a little bit about how that worked, because those were really the first, I guess, type of highway we would have.
So in order to drive more of the population in the area to like, this is the way that you go, this is an efficient highway, they would build plank roads that were easy. You lay down all these planks, they were easy for...
They were literally planks of wood, right?
Horses, and the wheels, it was a smooth ride. Samuel Hanna, who is on the not only on the cover of my book, but he drew a lot, or not drew, but designed a lot of our road infrastructure. A lot of roads.
And he has a street, Hanna Street.
A lot of roads are named for his family. For business associates, he was in charge of a lot of the canal work, president of a lot of the train companies that ran
Right,
through
wasn't
here.
he instrumental in working to bring the railroad?
Yeah. He knew that transportation was a huge factor in not only the history of Fort Wayne, but its future as a population center. So he himself actually built parts of these plank roads, and they were privately managed by companies that would inevitably go under a few years later, before it was transferred to the governments. So yeah, you would have tolls every 6 to 10 miles coming through and into Fort Wayne. Right.
And what were some of the names of the original plank roads?
So I'll use today's names because they're not too far off. Lima Road was a plank road.
And there still is a road that's called Old Plank, Lima, Old Plank.
Old 3.
Yeah.
So you have Lima, I believe Bluffton was one. There's Piqua Road, which barely exists anymore. It's only at this little segment.
Okay.
There's one more, the Goshen Road. Goshen Road was the fourth.
And was the Bluffton because it believed that was the one that went to Bluffton? Is that why?
Yeah,
so
they're usually named for their location.
For the desk that you go to.
Yep.
Okay. And so let's just stop for a second, and I want to know what's the difference between a street, a road, an avenue, a boulevard? How do you determine what you're going to call it?
In the early days of the planning of the city and the naming of the roads, they would always update it based on what the road looked like, if they made it wider or smaller. A street is usually smaller than a road. A drive is smaller than a road. A boulevard was supposed to have a strip of grass down the middle.
Right, or a median where people could walk.
Yeah.
Right.
But now if you look, at least downtown is an obvious example of them not continuing that tradition.
Well, we needed it to expand the roads.
Yeah.
Right.
They could have renamed it like Washington, because originally it was Washington Street, now it's Washington Boulevard. You don't have many, if any, grass strips down these roads.
Right.
Yeah. And then you have weird things like we used to have Court Street. So
that was originally where the court.
Yeah, it's where Courthouse Green is today, but having a suffix as the name of a street was confusing to people, because it's like, is it a court, or it referred to the courthouse, but is it like a dead end? You have all of those quirks. And then you have so they pretty much abandoned, minus like naming stuff, place, court. Those are all pretty much, for the most part, cul-de-sacs. There is one that I know wasn't renamed. It's off of St. Joe Center Road. Probably was a dead end at some point, but now it's a cul-de-sac. It's named after a cul-de-sac, but it goes through to another road. So weird things that they don't change.
Right. They just But there's also the idea that that if you are the developer of like a neighborhood or an area or something, that you can then, like, there's no system of how you name something. You could just name it, what you want.
A lot of them are, because realtors want to sell their property. A lot of them are trends, like naming stuff after trees was a trend, at least in Northeast Fort Wayne. It was a huge trend where I live.
French, there was the French places, right?
The French was mostly a historical thing, because we were part of France. Surprised, like Fort Wayne was part of New France. So I think that's something that people forget, that we were French at one point, and it's still in our flag, our city's flag. But you have a lot of English names that were trendy, I believe. I want to say in the 50s, but I can't remember off the top of my head. Yeah.
And then, so let's talk about some other people like Hannah, who, some of the good stories behind some of the names of the streets. What's some of the other good ones that you uncovered?
One that was a little bit cool, there's a neighborhood legend on the west side of Fort Wayne that one of the streets, it's Wilmar B Drive or Avenue something. It was named for a farmer who owned the land for all three of his daughters. So you have Margaret, Wilma, and I think Beatrice or something like that. They combined all their names into a street. That was, I think, really interesting, cool. And Clay Street, I think, has a good story behind it. Clay never came to Fort Wayne, as far as we know, but he wrote a letter of rejection, I guess, or of regret that he couldn't attend the canal's opening because he had to tend to his crops. But that we still have a street name for him. So
and also there's a story about a business that is technically Aaron's Oriental that's on a street that doesn't exist.
Yeah.
What's the deal there?
On Aaron's Oriental Rug Company's building, they have a street sign that says Broadway. So that's Broadway used to be called Market Street, so that's up to date. But then on the other side, they have George Street, which doesn't exist anymore. It's now West Brackenridge Street, because when you have like expansion of neighborhoods, all that, and roads somewhat line up, they'll either have a change where they connect, or they just push that name across one way or the other. So I believe that it was George Street for a while it was connected to Brackenridge. I believe they connected, I want to say at Calhoun Street. That's where a lot of roads connected and changed names. But yeah, so they still use that name.
Yeah. And then let's talk a little bit about the evolution and history of the interstate and what's happened there.
Yeah. So originally we were supposed to have a huge highway go through the heart of downtown. This
is during the state, the interstate, right?
It was right before the interstate. It was what was basically the predecessor to Interstate 69. So in the 40s, we were going to have a huge highway go through downtown. I believe, I don't remember, there might have been 2 highways, one north and then one east and west. That never happened. The citizens didn't want it. They voted 63% didn't want it, so it didn't ever go through. And the blueprints for those are few and far between. There's a couple out there, but that was the predecessor to Interstate 69 in the 1950s, so the next decade. But I-69 would go around town instead of through it.
Right, and then we also got another interstate, right?
For 469,
which you said doesn't really necessarily go anywhere, right?
Yeah, it was mostly as a way to redirect traffic from through downtown. Like semi-trucks, you don't want them coming through a place that you're trying to make a populated area.
Right.
It's a route that goes around to all the other highways. So that canceled all of the highways that went east and west through downtown and some of the north and south highways.
So those canceled out some of the
the US highways and the state highways are now either don't go through Fort Wayne anymore or were rerouted around the city.
And you found something that was interesting about the development of the interstate in terms of when Eisenhower, right? Tell me about that.
The interstate system as a whole, President Eisenhower, when he was in World War II in Germany, he saw their Autobahn system that was able to evacuate entire cities very quickly. Troops could get across the country quickly. That was the inspiration behind building a new highway system, not to replace the old numbered highway system, but to help, if there was a nuclear attack, evacuate all these cities.
It would be evacuated, but okay.
Yeah, the highways these new highways would be able to have both directions of traffic go one way.
Okay.
So they would.
And so when they created the interstate, there was also things that happened, because I was asking you about this turn, that there's this cemetery on Coldwater when you're about to get onto I-69 going south. There's just this little cemetery that's left, but there's no marker or anything.
Yeah.
So what's the story there?
There used to be a Lutheran church there. They never moved the cemetery. I'm not sure why.
Maybe they didn't want to dig up all the people.
Yeah. US 27 used to be on Coldwater Road right there. And so the land was given by the church to the state, probably after the church closed, for the interchange between 27 and Interstate 69. But there's still a cemetery in the interchange right there, even though 27 doesn't even run on Coldwater there anymore. It runs near Lima Road.
But we do have, because most of the time you don't really refer to it as like US 27, but US 27, it is still used as a marker, right?
Yeah, it's one of the few that wasn't really altered when we got 469. The north part of it was changed a little bit, and it actually ends in Fort Wayne now, because Michigan abandoned it, and then all of the counties above us abandoned it. It ends once you hit Interstate 69, because the interstate is so much faster,
right? And
there's more upkeep than a highway. But 27 is one of the few that still runs through the city.
And what's the difference between the Indiana highways versus the U.S. highways? What's the story there with all the Indiana highways?
The Indiana highways came first. Those are state managed roads. Indiana 930, which is Coliseum now, used to be US 30 before it was rerouted city didn't want control of it, so they're like, we're not going to manage it. It's the state's problem. So they forced the state of Indiana to take control over it, and that's why that's named there. But yeah, the state has more control over the Indiana highways. U.S. highways were the predecessor to the interstate. Some of them are still managed. Right. Most famous, of course, is US 66. That is mostly still together.
Right.
A lot of it was replaced and bypassed by interstates. That I-80 is one big one, I think, that off the top of my head, that is one that comes to mind.
Yeah, it's also really surprising. Like, you would think that, oh, if a street or road goes through Fort Wayne, oh, it's owned by the city, but that's not the case, right?
Yeah.
It's like, it was even just trying to figure out who owns what, or, you know, I always ask you about why are there parts of the highway or that's named after somebody? You know, tell me how that all works.
So I'll get to the naming, the memorial highways in a second, but the state definitely has an interest in transportation, even if they don't own the road. They need to get places. The seat of Allen County is in Fort Wayne, and the county is a division of the state more than a city is. And like how the government works. But so they'll take an interest in fixing roads, but it's just who pays for it, all this stuff. It becomes more clear when you make something like Indiana 14, Indiana 930, how much of the funding is going to come from the city, the county. Interstate 469, even though it's a federal highway, was paid for by Allen County. And it's, I think, to date, the most expensive project in the county's history.
And why did the county want it so badly?
So as I said before, the semi-trucks through downtown. A lot of sidewalks actually expanded and made some of the roads smaller downtown, I think following the introduction of 469. And now we're having a lot of businesses pop up along 469. So that a lot of the exits used to lead to nowhere and kind of still do. But you have the GM plant was big, especially in the planning. They're like, oh, we'll come to Fort Wayne if you build this. So that was a huge push towards actually finishing this project. It was supposed to initially only go a quarter of the way around town. Then they made it the entire way around town. And the part that they hadn't initially planned on building between Maple Crest and Interstate 69 is by far the busiest segment of the interstate. Yeah.
Why is that?
I think a lot of it is because it's the drain of traffic from the northeast side to the whole interstate system, all of Fort Wayne's road systems. You can go up through that little segment right there to the other parts of town quite quickly, or other parts of the state. There's not really anything else on the other side that would be efficient to get to if you live over there. So it's mostly just a semi-truck area after that exit.
But it shows that there's a lot of politics involved, and even when Fort Wayne started, there was politics involved with some of the naming. And so, what are some of those kinds of stories that you uncovered?
I mean, we have a lot for the presidents,
right?
And almost like indisputably, a lot of the presidents, there wasn't that we know of a lot of controversy at the time. There might be now, especially with Calhoun Street, which is like, I don't like to get into necessarily the politics of that, but we have a list in case the city ever wants to rename any of these roads, which is a trend that we're seeing across the country right now. Right. It's not up to me or us whether or not the road name changes, but it's like, here's a list if you want to, if you absolutely want to. Again, Calhoun Street's probably the most at risk for being renamed for so many reasons, but it is one of the original roads through the city, and a lot of people don't necessarily associate the road name with the person. They associate it with all the memories they've had on that street. There's, I think, McClellan Street, which is, again, named for one of Lincoln's opponents. There was from what I understand, and I haven't confirmed or looked into a lot of it, but they believe there was a famous journalist, at least according to the County Historical Society, there was a famous photojournalist who took pictures of like the middle lower class living on McClellan Street. I would say they associate that, especially with this documentation, that they associate life on that street with the name rather than that person.
Right.
So that's a big thing when you look at renaming a road. You have to take into consideration people associating their memories with that name rather than the legacy of whoever.
Because it takes on a life of its own.
Yeah.
But the reality of it is that in today's world we are re-examining. I mean, that should there be monuments or should there be honorary kinds of identifications for individuals? I mean, do you think that because we are taking a second look at this, that there most likely not going to be more streets named after people?
I think there will be, but I think there's going to be a longer process, a more in-depth process to when people have roads named for them. I'm sure that one day when Mr. Sara from Sweetwater passes, he will have a road named for him. Because he's preserved a lot of our historical buildings with his own money.
Right.
With the Sweetwater has brought so many jobs to the area. He has contributed
there could be Sweetwater Lane.
Yeah, there could be something like that. But his philanthropy too, his personal philanthropy, all of that, it's definitely worthy and sometimes more worthy than some of the people that we've had road names for.
But let's talk about, because you had an actual experience of trying to get a road name changed or named after someone, and it's not that easy of a process.
No, it is not.
So tell me what you were trying to do.
So first off, there's several ways that you can try to go about renaming a road. There's no formal process for it. One thing that we mentioned earlier were the memorial parkways. You can always submit to the county if someone dies or something to dedicate a certain road to them, but it doesn't change the actual name of the road.
Right. Is there a length of the road that becomes part of the memorial highway?
I believe it's only a certain length of it.
Oh, yeah.
But Interstate 69 is it's not called this by a lot of the populace, but it is Ronald Reagan Memorial Parkway, I believe, the entire length of it.
Do we have a connection with Ronald Reagan?
He actually came here, and during the flood of 82, I believe it's 82, he came and actually stacked sandbags with the kids here.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
So going back to my experience with changing a road name, I discovered that the actress Jenna Fisher from The Office was born here. And actually I found the house and I've talked to the owners of the house. They didn't know either until I told them. They were surprised. But even though she only lived here a little bit, I was like, well, why not put our generation who loves The Office? It's a cult classic now, I guess.
The sitcom The Office, right.
Why not put our footprint on the map?
Okay. But it wasn't, you didn't want the road named after the actress.
No.
You wanted the road named after the character. That she is, which is who?
Her name's Pam Beasley.
Okay. So you wanted Pam Beasley, and so what happened?
So I contacted my city council representative, Paul Inslee. He was going to help me, direct me to the right place, but the county caught wind of it, and it's the roundabout in question. I thought it'd be easier to do a roundabout than an actual road.
Why?
None of them are named. So it's not going to affect anyone's directions or addresses or anything like that. They said no for some reasons that aren't historically backed up. They said they don't name them for living people. So many of our roads have been named for living people.
Such as while they were living, right?
Bar Street, he named it for himself.
Right, that's true.
Again, he owned it, but still, there's a lot of our roads that are maintained by the county and the city that have been named for actual people. And then going into the fictional part of it, we have a quote downtown in, I believe it's called the Talking Sidewalks of Bar Street or Berry Street.
Oh, that's why they have those those quotes in the bricks.
They're people who are related some way to Fort Wayne.
That's like the ones that are in the in front of the Embassy Theater too, right?
The Embassy is a little bit different. Those are people who contributed directly to the Embassy.
Oh, okay.
But these quotes are people who have said something about Fort Wayne, very famous people.
That's what. No, they should put a little sign there or something that tells you what they are. No, there's no. I just read these random quotes while you're walking around.
Yeah, and you have to do a lot of digging to see why they have to do a Fort Wayne. So going with the fictional character kind of thing, there is a character from the show MASH from the 70s who was from Fort Wayne in the show.
Okay.
They put a quote from him in that sidewalk.
From the character?
Yeah, from the character.
Okay. Do you remember who that was?
Frank Burns.
Oh, he wasn't liked. He was Captain Frank Burns. He was not liked. No.
But he has a quote that says, "I sure wish that I was home." It's one of my favorite quotes. I post it on my Facebook page every time I get home from like an assignment or something that I'm covering. I had an assignment in DC not too long ago where I posted that when I got back home to let everyone know I was home. But so that's like, we've had infrastructure that has fictional characters that are prominent in our culture.
Right.
So that process of getting that roundabout change was a failure, but it showed me more of the modern way that we do things. The county doesn't build a lot of roads on its own anymore. We have our own infrastructure now with road names that have been used for hundreds of years.
Okay.
The newer roads are named after developers or by the developers.
Right.
So there's no really formal process for changing a road name. There's one city council document that I found that citizens wanted to rename when we extended Spy Run Avenue. Instead of calling it Spy Run Extended, they wanted to call it Johnny Appleseed Parkway because it goes near Johnny Appleseed Park.
Right. Isn't there a Johnny C. Apple? There's Johnny C. Apple something, isn't there?
The park.
But there's no road?
Not to my memory now. But they wanted to rename it that. They petitioned the government. They were going to do it. Unfortunately, there was a referendum by other people on the street. They left it as is.
And what's the deal with Spy Run? How did it get its name?
Spy Run, it's an interesting story. Captain William Wells, who Wells Street is named for, and the Wells Street corridor, all of that land was owned by him. It was a gift from Congress in 1818, I think. His nickname from the Native Americans was Carrot Top because of his orange hair. He originally fought with the Native Americans here. I think he married into their family, was raised by them maybe. But he had led a group of spies along this brook, which is Spy Run Creek, because the spies used to run along that creek. So the road that goes along that creek is named Spy Run after an event in our history. Yeah. And
what did you tell me something about the smallest park or street?
Oh yes,
yeah,
Orff Park. It is 0.2 acres. It's gotten smaller through the years too. It was originally owned by a guy named, I think, John Orff. He owned a mill near where Orff Park is. He donated the land for the park. It's the only feature of the park. He does have a road name for him somewhere else.
That's nice.
The only feature of the park is a monument to the Aqueduct Club. So there was an aqueduct near that park that was part of the Wabash Erie Canal. It used to go over, the canal went over the river at that point.
Wow.
Which is interesting, water going over water.
Right.
But there was a group of kids who used to swim in the aqueduct. They made this club. They would have, after everything had closed, after the canal had closed, they would have a group meeting every year. And then they engraved all of their names into this monument in that park.
So are we good at, besides my cemetery, but there was a reason, are we good at sort of maintaining some of those historical elements in when we were removing or re-looking at how the streets are laid out in Fort Wayne? Are we good at sort of making note of those?
We do a good job. That's one of my goals, is to keep a record of everything from now, at least until I die, hopefully in Fort Wayne somewhere here. But We have recently done a good job. We have Arch now, which preserves the buildings. We have some really good people in the city government who I've worked with on this book, fact checking stuff. He's really good. We have the Allen County Historical Society, who does a lot of record keeping, a lot. We have the second largest genealogy center in the country in the library, second only to the Mormon church, which is gigantic. So us being second to them is an accomplishment.
And you would never think that there would be a genealogical connection to streets and roads.
Yeah.
But now we also have the Fort Wayne Road Commission.
Oh, yeah.
So tell me about that.
So in 2019, I decided to start posting all these facts to get them out there, have people remember them, get a connection to all of these things that
literally and figuratively, right?
They drive over these streets every day.
Right.
They don't know the history of it. A lot of our roads can tell even the history of an area. So I know a lot of people who live in the neighborhood called Paper Mill. When I was looking at these old maps, you see there was actually a ton of paper mills in the area. Then there's other places over there that are named after different mills that were in the area. You wouldn't think that, just thought, oh, it's a cool name, but the roads are named for those industries. So letting people know that through the Facebook page, and then I was like, I have to update these old books. If I'm gonna refer people to something, I have to compile a list of some sort, a book of some sort, in order to do this. So that's started compiling that back in, I'd say 2019. I was doing note taking and then sat down and started writing in January of 2020.
And what surprised you most about, one, you recognize the importance of history, but two, all the paths and areas that you were sort of, the rabbit holes that you were led down, that by wanting to find out why a street was named why it was. What do you think about that?
Like how what was my favorite part, or?
Yeah, or just the idea of recognizing, the importance of history.
I saw it was unfortunate when a street name was changed. It erased a part of that area's history. People who had memories growing up on X street. Right. It's almost like you erase a part of their personal family history. Right. Then you also forget the people for whom the street was named. The people who come to mind, George Street is named for Mother Eliza George. We have a monument or a plaque to her on the other side of town from where George Street was. But we tend to forget these people when you erase these names, which is one of the big things with our new trend of renaming things. Right. Some of these people did horrible things. Some of them were able to somewhat redeem themselves towards the end of their life. I know Washington, they did a really cool story real quick. Washington and Lafayette, who we both have streets named for, they knew each other. Their streets intersect in our city. It's like a kind of a friendship intersection. They had been working towards the end of their lives. Lafayette hated slavery a lot, and he was trying to work with Washington to help trying to not abolish, but kind of nudge the country and the culture towards abolition, which is something that we did with the Constitution and the Declaration, which the Declaration had initially included something about slavery, but you wouldn't get the support of Southern states for the Revolution. But it did really set into motion this idea that, we have a democracy where people can put forward these ideas. It set up a situation where we could one day abolish slavery. So that was something that they were working on towards the end of their lives. Calhoun, on the other hand, had no remorse for slavery, not even calling it like a necessary evil, but calling it a positive good.
Because he was focused on the economics.
Not only the economics, but just the idea of it. He liked it for some reason. He has very little connection to Fort Wayne, which is one reason why I think they might rename it in the future. I've heard some people talk about it. and then it's unfortunate that it goes, Calhoun Street actually, I believe, passes Southside High School, which is predominantly African American.
It's straight through the South Side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So. It's unfortunate that there you have that juxtaposition of people who would be not in Indiana, but people who Calhoun saw as less than human.
Right.
That street going past that school.
And you don't realize that the names, have meaning, but I'm very glad that we have you to keep our roads and streets straight, literally and figuratively. But as you know, at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. And Proust believed by answering these questions, a person reveals his or her true nature. So as I said, you're usually behind the camera, but because you're sitting at the table today, you get to answer them. So what is your favorite word?
My favorite word, I'd have to say potential.
Potential.
Yeah.
Okay. What is your least favorite word?
Least favorite word. Anything that's written in all caps. It's just it's people use it for an argument. All caps isn't going to make your argument any better. So any word that's written in all caps.
Okay.
Yeah.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
When people are willing to have an open mind, people willing to listen, have a conversation like you are with the show. Anything like that is really, it's inspiring.
And what turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
And I guess the opposite of that, people who are closed-minded don't want to listen to you.
Don't want to have a dialogue or conversation.
Yeah.
What sound or noise do you love?
I'd have to go with, I'd say an old, well-maintained car sounds, it's an amazing sound.
What sound or noise do you hate?
Nails on a chalkboard, definitely.
Now, you're still in college, so we can't say, but what profession do you hope that you would like to attempt?
Ultimately, definitely way down the road, probably go into politics of some sort.
Wow.
Yeah.
And what profession would you not want to do?
As much as I like to educate people, I probably wouldn't want to be a teacher. I don't want to deal with the discipline, having to discipline my students. I just want to tell them the facts and be out. Okay.
And this one's not necessarily fair, but what do you consider your greatest achievement to date?
To date, the book.
The book.
Yeah.
Well, that's a feat of the development,
yeah,
and that you got
it was tough. Yeah.
Published. It's amazing. So, who, living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
Probably Henry Clay. He was he was Speaker of the House.
And that's who the Clay
is
named after. And okay, again, you're a little young for this, but how would you like to die?
Either peacefully or for a good cause. I want to have something if someone has to die for a cause, is let it be me. For a good cause, hopefully.
Wow.
But yeah.
Okay. That'll help you.
Either that or peacefully.
Well, that'll help you in politics because you got to put yourself out there for the cause.
Oh yeah.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
I just want to hear that I did what I could do to make the world a better place.
Oh. Well, who would have thought that you and I could have an hour-long conversation about the names of streets and roads?
It could have been even longer.
Right. No, but it's great that you have a passion and that you followed it, and you're bringing it out there, and that you're also going to be the keeper of this information going forward, and you're going to write it down.
I'm going to write it down. Hopefully, update this book in maybe a decade. So.
Well, I think it'll probably be sooner than that.
Maybe sooner, maybe later.
Right, and that's great. I mean, we need it.
Thank you.
So history matters.
Yes, it does.
Please join me next time when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.